Blueprint for change. A plan to overcome challenges. Blueprint for change. A guide to help create opportunities. Blueprint for change. Thought-provoking conversations. Blueprint for change. Why wait when you can contribute to the Blueprint for change?
Hello, Bahamas and listeners around the world. Welcome to Blueprint for Change, the show designed to change your perspective and how you think about the national issues facing the Bahamas. We want to help you discover a new blueprint for change. Blueprint for Change is sponsored by Michael Diggis and Associates. I am your co-host, Dale Happy Knowles. Our host, Michael Diggis, this evening is on special assignment for his professional avocation, and we ask God's blessings on that endeavor. Tonight, we will continue our discussion on the mindset necessary for the new built environment for success. This evening, we will explore the digital framework for the new built environment and good governance with Rowena Bethel. Mrs. Bethel, as I know her to be Rowena, is a lawyer and public governance specialist operating from Dubai, United Arab Emirates. She is a retired public servant. Her former positions include legal advisor at the Ministry of Finance, head of Compliance Commission, and director of National Insurance Board. She also has a master's degree in IT law and policy. She designed in 2003 the e-commerce laws and a policy statement, which introduced a conducive legal environment for global e-business in the Bahamas. A host of committees and task force that she has already served on. And so we welcome you, Rowena, to Blueprint for Change. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dale. It's very early in the morning here in Dubai, but I thank you for the invitation and for an opportunity to discuss a topic that's obviously extremely important to the country at its particular point in time. It's always been important from my perspective. It's an area that I have a particular passion in, but the pandemic and all that's occurred in its wake, I think, has shaken the entire world to recognize how vitally important it is to get at least the electronic component of an economy up and going as quickly as possible.
Right. So I was going to say that they say that successful people do the little things that unsuccessful people are not prepared to do. And you surely, being in Dubai, some 9 hours ahead of us, that puts you at 3:30, as you said, that surely is sacrifice, and you depict success. So we congratulate you on that and helping us in the Bahamas build a new mindset as to how we can be successful here.
Not at all. I pretended I had to get it for Junkanoo.
For Junkanoo, yes, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we won't be having Junkanoo this year, but made a couple of suggestions on how they could have done it, but it seems like everybody is in a panic freeze mode to focus on one thing, which is fine. We'll get it next year. So I believe that good governance is the foundation for community success. In the digital domain, the framework for such is the law, which provides the opportunity for good governance. We ask in our invite, are we there yet? That's a takeoff from some articles that I've written on Facebook that points to the imaginary line to the position of political, economic, and social empowerment. So in getting there, we find that telecommunications is the foundation for digital. And some 35 years ago, I ventured home from graduating and supercharged the national rollout of the digital domain. 5 years later, we were pretty much covered with at least one layer or two of digital in the Bahamas. And then over the years to come, we seem to go into some snail's pace in terms of the growth of it beyond the networks and getting it rolled out within the whole community or society that we have. COVID has come along, as you mentioned, and 2 cowboy slaps and everybody wants to do digital. So we're gonna ask the questions this evening in relation to that and the framework that will allow us to be successful. And so we ask that if you can summarize for the listeners what it means for digital in the legal environment and how is the mindset different between how we approach it in the Bahamas compared to how it's being approached in Dubai.
Okay, I think for a successful digital economy, you need far more than laws. Laws are an important part of the overall ecosystem that has to be put in place. But typically one would find that where countries have been successful in this journey, i.e. this transition from sort of an analog environment into digital through the various revolutions, that there has been an approach that was very holistic, essentially, starting first with a focus very much on government transforming itself in order to be in a position to marshal and to lead the change that was required within society. This was really in reaction to the thrust that the business community had taken up. They saw the advantages that ICTs brought. They capitalized off those. They were doing extremely well. What began to hold them back and to slow things down to some degree was the fact that the governmental side was not keeping up. The internet, as you know, is borderless. It's also a virtual environment. And what that meant was that there was a situation where conflict between laws of different states was arising. And in order to introduce the level of harmony that was necessary to permit the continued rollout of the internet uninterrupted and to really exploit its potential, it was necessary to begin to look at how to implement laws around the world that were compatible, if nothing else, so that if one is to engage in business with an entity online from Europe, that the same framework that would enable the transaction to have legality, validity, and be recognized within the courts, that was in place in the Bahamas. Otherwise, there is a question of how do you protect the rights of the parties in that particular transaction. In the case of the Bahamas, actually, it was quite interesting. As happens with a lot of our revolutionary measures, it really didn't come about as a focus on building an information society. The impetus really started with the financial services sector. I distinctly remember, because that was around the time that I had joined Ministry of Finance, specifically to look at rolling out and helping to build this information society. And the private sector, the financial services sector became aware that there was a growing movement abroad, led primarily, I think, by the Bermudians for offshore e-commerce, recognizing that the internet, as well as the underlying ICT components, permitted business units to be dispersed across different jurisdictions, depending on the most appropriate jurisdiction in which that particular unit could operate. For the Bahamas and many of the offshore centers, what was appealing was the fact that headquarters and corporate functions could be centered in locations like the Bahamas, which then would have an opportunity to leverage off the financial services product and corporate services that we already had in place, a kind of very solid international business environment. So I was invited by Sir William at the time, who was minister, and Mrs. Ruth Miller, who was really very visionary. She was the financial secretary. Focus on this area. It was an area that as I said, I had a passion for, and I had started to delve into probably 6 or 7 years earlier by attending various IT law summer schools at Cambridge University. So the focus was to develop the laws very rapidly, act as flags to show essentially that the Bahamas was up and ready and capable of handling this type of business. At the same time that the offshore world was very focused on the potential for offshore e-commerce. Of course, the international agencies were as well, particularly the tax agencies, because the benefits that a lot of these jurisdictions offered was sort of amiable tax environments. So the offshore, the international agencies and major onshore economies began to really look at how they might be able to tackle the issue that offshore financial centers were presenting in relation to this issue of taxation, and not just offshore financial centers, amongst themselves as well, because you have the Irelands of this world and the Delawares of this world, where potentially the same type of competition would arise. So that was really the impetus for it. As time progressed, we first of all had to deal with liberalizing the communication sector, and I was involved in that work. It culminated finally in the award of the second license some 16 years later. I think it was 2016, the second mobile license was awarded, but we began the process of liberalizing communications. That was the sort of first platform. We then also, which I thought was an excellent approach, which was not unlike the approach that was being adopted elsewhere, we began to involve school kids. We had huge meetings at the hotel, I think it was Crystal Palace at the time, that we had the seniors come in and discuss with school children from around the Bahamas what their vision was for a Bahamas that was modernized and that, you know, adequately leverage ICT. Out of that also came the legislation, because we needed that, and four pieces of legislation actually that were introduced at the time was, of course, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, which validated business transactions and contracts, e-contracts and electronic transactions in online. Also, the Cybercrime Convention was implemented in the form of the Computer Misuse Act. And I will say here that both of those acts have done fairly well in terms of maintaining the international standard based on the conventions that were used as the foundation for the implementation of those two pieces of legislation. There probably, you know, there's tweaking in one or two areas, but largely those pieces of legislation met their objective. The third was the Data Protection Act, and I'll speak about a little bit later on. The Data Protection Act at the time was close to state of the art, with the exception that it required additional measures that had to be introduced by regulation. That, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, never happened. Well, two events intervened, actually, that kind of slowed down the momentum that was growing around that time, and that had this sort of very passionate focus from the Ministry of Finance. One was One was the change in government. Two was that I was taken away to focus on the blacklisting initiatives. So the policy focus, the concerted policy focus, not the technical side of it, but the policy focus of building the information society was lost within central government, I believe, at the time. And as a result, and also, I think I would have mentioned that I was taken away to deal with the blacklisting, so we lost the policy focus, and then we had a change of government. And the changes of government, the frequency with which they were happening post 2000 meant essentially that with each incoming administration, it almost felt as if we went back to square one instead of having had a long-term approach to this transformation that was so desperately needed to ensure that.
If I could stop you right there, because I was going to ask, and you so well linked it all together, which been that based on these laws being created in 2003, what was the reason why we haven't implemented them? And so you're talking about some really critical issues that has hindered good governance as a whole, and in particular in the digital arena. So as you continue on, then what challenges is faced in being able to address these other two laws? The fourth one, I'm not sure you said yet, but going forward in this environment where we are turning over government so quickly, policymakers so quickly that we there's no continuity, for lack of a better term.
Right, right. And continuity is vital. As I said, I think that the contributing factors as to, from my perspective, others may see it differently. From my perspective was the concerted loss of focus in the policy space. The sort of looking at what it is we needed to do and making sure that attention was being paid to that all along the way. So we lost that. We did implement the data. We passed the four laws. One, Electronic Transactions Communications Act. Two, cybercrime laws. Three, the Data Protection Act at the time. The fourth one is little known, and it's interesting actually, because I think that's one of the reasons as well that we have sort of lagged behind others. We put laws on the books, but they're never activated or implemented effectively. Now, the fourth was the Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts Act. And the reason that I chose to implement or certainly put forward that measure for to be passed along with a package of e-commerce legislation was because in the e-commerce space, the standard form contracts is a norm by and large. People simply don't have this face-to-face negotiation, especially in consumer relations. And the Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts Act was intended to introduce a measure that protected consumers in these circumstances. And what it does essentially is invalidate certain contracts that significantly reduce the liabilities and obligations that the vendor may have. Now, whenever I mention that, I get sort of blank stares or shocks from people because no one really has picked up on the value of that particular measure. So it's been there, it is there, it is fairly forward thinking for our jurisdiction because not many other countries have it in place. The larger country, of course, but in terms of the size and development of the Bahamas, there are not many that have that particular measure in place. We did establish the Data Protection Commissioner's Office, and I know for my duration of time there, and before I left government proper, when I left completely, that area was never adequately resourced, manage the function that it was intended to manage. And that I think was regrettable in many ways, because that now is really front and center for any digital society. It's the data strategies, it's the national data strategies, it's the importance and significance of personal information, the thrust to protect it globally because of the potential for its abuse and the fact that the violations that it could result in to people. The current environment for the digital economy is very, very heavily dependent on data. It is data driven.
Right.
And it looks at things like people's behaviors. It makes predictions about those. It makes presumptions. People are targeted. And as a result, we have monitoring and tracking and all those things that happen with all the various devices and mechanisms that are available now over the internet, and all of the technologies, the AI, cloud computing, everything is data-driven, and it's extremely valuable and it's extremely important. In addition to the fact that, and I'm speaking really not understanding what is currently in place.
Right.
Certainly, in terms of the data landscape internationally, the Bahamas is not necessarily right, although we have had the law in place for a long time. In order for us to meet the requirement currently, we have to substantially abate the law that we have on the books, and we have to substantially implement a framework that's going to ensure that it's effective and it meets its intended objective.
Great. So as we almost prepare for our break, as time does fly, that you mentioned education or people don't know. So is that, I mean, I come from a telecom world, so like we're in the front of everything. So this might seem strange, but how far back are we in terms of being digitally educated in the major players, the policymakers, the drivers of networks and infrastructure and institutions and whatever, not just the government itself, but do we need a massive education program to bring us up to date so we could understand how these things interact?
I think, Dale, it's all part and parcel of the framework for transforming your society. Mm-hmm. It's not a one-shot deal. It's an ongoing exercise. So I believe that we are further behind than we should be, quite frankly. But I believe, again, that is due to the fact that focus was taken off this particular aspect. There are other contributing factors that I believe weaken our position, one of which is the siloed structure of our governance framework at home. You will tend to find, and I've heard it periodically from various quarters, and I know that there are different efforts that have occurred over the years and continue to occur, but it's not being done, or at least it's not being presented, it's not being seen as a holistic approach to what's going on. When I say holistic approach, we have many different actors around government. We also work very, very strongly in our governance framework works very strongly with an aura of secrecy. Right. Intended or not, it is often very difficult to find out what is going on and what is important for people to get on with aspects of their lives. The digital effort is certainly one area where governments are encouraged at the international level to always have sort of a participatory, consensus-oriented approach to moving forward, particularly as you move to consolidate all of the services and all of the activities that the business of government that takes place. I read bits and pieces, but certainly it is easier to sit down and go to a website and find out precisely what is happening in terms of that transformational shift. In most of the advanced economies, certainly here in the UAE, you know every step of the way what's going on. Public comment is invited. Of course, most of this is done electronically, and I don't know how far we have progressed in terms of really utilizing ICTs to create a broad framework of general and ongoing engagement. I saw during COVID, for example, there's an awful lot of complaints about people not understanding what was happening, not having sufficient information. I can say to you that the experience that I had here in Dubai was certainly an eye-opener. Every step of the way, there was absolute clarity as to what was expected. how what citizens were what residents, were expected to do, what they're required to do. And every change involving the move towards smart communities, smart society, all of that is very public. People know about it. People are encouraged to submit their views. And there's a sense that there is a partnership between the residents and the government in moving this particular initiative forward. I don't quite get the sense that we're there yet in the Bahamas. I see efforts at it. I think Marlon is doing a fairly admirable job in the Ministry of Finance with his outreaches and with his efforts to move the needle forward. But it's not enough. If you're going to deal with this, with a digital economy and a digital environment, there has to be far greater coherence between all of the agencies, or things like the once only principle.
Yes.
And we talk about,
before you go into what we need to do, because we're going to deal with that right after the break. But one last question before the break is, does the Bahamas digital laws enable entrepreneurship and good governance as they are situated right now? You mentioned two of them are in place, intact and robust. One has some extra activity and the fourth one has some significant. Is that in a position to really cause right now good governance and entrepreneurship? Because coming out of COVID, we need new opportunities for people to be entrepreneurs.
Do you wish for me to answer that before you go to the break?
Yes, that one, and then we go to the break. Yeah.
Okay, well, what I would like to do actually, Dale, I only mentioned the legislative measures that deals with sort of protecting rights in relation to the use of the internet. There is also a batch of laws which are regulatory in nature that governs the components of the internet. And we have some of those measures in place at home. Again, I believe that for us, as in other spheres, the challenge is effective implementation so that the result that we're looking for is actually manifested. So I can speak a little bit more to that once the break is over. In terms of encouraging entrepreneurship, I don't know if digital laws, that is the function necessarily of the digital laws as we have discussed. And digital laws can be sort of so narrow, it can be so wide. I believe that in order for both good governance and entrepreneurship to thrive, we have to transform our public administrative machinery in order to introduce the enablers and the facilitating measures that will allow that to happen. The digital laws are important because, as I said, they protect rights and they ensure that there is respect for law in operating in the internet. But I believe there's an awful lot more that has to be in place in order for these features to be enabled or facilitated.
Yes, okay, so we will tackle that in a greater way after the break. So, Producer Ali, you've been listening to Blueprint for Change, the show, as we mentioned, to help you be able to face the things that which the Bahamas are faced with today. So we'll be right back after these messages. Eleanor Roosevelt said that great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. The ultimate design starts from thought, and thought is a product of one's mindset.
Let's change our mindset from being employees to being employers, from being workers to being owners.
Why don't we tell it the opportunity instead of the job, the job?
I think one of the things that we need to understand first for us to appropriately, I guess, get the litmus test on how we see the creatives, how we see creatives in society in general, is how we understand and value our own creativity.
What's the steps to get out of the rut?
Leaders have to lead. Leaders have to lead.
The challenge that we have is with the political the public sector, where they need to understand that the private sector should take the lead and they should be followers and listen to the private sector and let them take the lead role in causing the kind of environment that we need to happen. And like I said, politicians tend to want to take the lead and be discussing technical issues that they have no knowledge of. And that is the main problem and the mindset that we have to change, please.
Welcome back to Blueprint for Change. We are talking with Rowena Bethel, the designer of the digital framework that we're going to be moving forward to success in the Bahamas. Rowena, you are in the Mecca of the Nirvana, and I'm in the Bahamas, the paradise, God's paradise. Some 7,700 miles away, 9 hours as we talk, but we're operating at the speed of light. So that means that we're now in a full-fledged global environment. Tell us, digital puts us at the fingertips. What is the mindset behind the changes necessary that you speak of to enable the digital opportunity and good governance as a whole?
The mindset, it has to be driven at the governmental level, at the public institutions level, okay? Mm-hmm. And the mindset has to be one that is demonstrably, which is a word that Sir William always used, demonstrably committed to change. What we have in place is not going to carry us in terms of the public institutions. And it's evident from the discontent and the malcontent that you see occurring within society, which are all indications that not only is there a lack of trust in the institutions and their ability to meet the needs of citizens and the residents and even the needs of the leaders. So there has to be that commitment. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. So it's going to go beyond election life cycles. That's one thing that has to be recognized. And I think it sort of harkens back to the efforts that were put into what I would regard as the original sort of blueprint that we were working on, which was the National Development Plan. We need to have that type of consensus input from people. The National Development Plan may even at this particular point in time need to be updated because COVID and Dorian completely changed the landscape in many respects for us, although it did speak to those things. Beyond the blueprint itself, we need to be looking at a strategic plan that is sufficiently agile and flexible to allow for adjustments to be made over the course of time. This is vitally important. In order to do this, the driver for this will be public institutions that can make it happen. It will happen as long as we have a partnership, a true and genuine partnership between the public and the private sectors. But the public and the private sectors, to me, are not able to harness the benefits of that real and substantial partnership that is necessary in order for us to advance to the level that we would like to, particularly with the digital society. And I'm not the first person that said this. There are any number of reports that the government has commissioned itself over time that pointed specifically to these institutional weaknesses within the structure that we currently have. Mm-hmm. So to my mind, the mindset that we need has to really be led at the level of the public institutions and the policymakers. And there has to be a very strong, it's going to be an enormous exercise for us. It will not be that easy. It's not going to be easy. But if we put the kind of, if we can get buy-in as to the length of time phased or staged efforts can happen, that would be good. I don't know, and I'm speaking really without the benefit of truly understanding what is happening in government at this particular point in time. I don't know if in fact, you know, this is on the drawing board. If it is, my only concern is that it's not adequately shared with the public at large, so that persons may be able to contribute in a way that would help its adoption as it's rolled out.
Yes, and so with that, then that will require then that the government would be wise to afford itself with professionals and craftsmen and the like who have the background, competent background in order to drive that exercise within government to move forward.
They may well do. I don't know. As I said, it's not terribly transparent as it is, which is unfortunate because it's really the one time and the one area and the one initiative where transparency ought to be front and center. And when I talk about transparency, I mean ensuring that the people the stakeholders who are members of the public fully understand and fully are on board with what is going to make significant improvements or intended to make significant improvements in their lives. And one other important feature of all of this, Dale, as well, that I haven't mentioned thus far, and that is the importance of a freedom of information. If you are going to build entrepreneurial opportunities in a digital society, government needs to move towards open government programs and access very, very quickly. They need to be able to move in that direction because it's that information that's going to spur innovation. I'm not sure that we have the same things that, you know, most other countries who are very serious about this space, which are innovation hubs and sandboxes where the government opens its data largely in fact, actually in the UAE, it's not even just citizens and residents. They actually recruit globally people with the skill sets to help them improve and add value from the wealth of data that they have at their disposal. It's being done by, I know both of the large financial sector free zones here, which is the DIFC, as well as the ADGM, which is in Abu Dhabi. DIFC is here in Dubai. They are actively and aggressively and enthusiastically working with industry, including banks, including financial institutions, to allow use of the data so that they can move the society ahead and improve living standards, to improve accessibility to government services, and generally all around to improve life. I believe that is something I haven't heard that is happening in our country. I would like to see it happen in our country. Of course, you know, we have to, first of all, also work on the whole exercise of digitizing the wealth of information the government has at its disposal. It's going to be a big effort, but I believe once that has taken place, we will begin to realize enormous benefits from the innovative and value-added outputs that are likely to come from startups and from others in the space who can use that information and also relieve government of some of these, you know, burdensome responsibilities for delivering government services. It can be done by the private sector.
Okay, so on that note then, from the Facebook environment, there's a number of questions that came inbox to us. I guess they didn't want to post them in public, but they tend to relate to the digital data and being managed by multinational companies. You touched on the Data Protection Act and whether the fingerprint of that are digital, each person's fingerprint, digital fingerprint, and the data that is supposed to be for Bahamians or Bahamians related is being maybe housed in some other country and the like. And so how does the data protection deal with that in terms of storage of jurisdictions? And my pet peeve was the petitions that people ask you to sign digitally. I never felt comfortable with those because I didn't think that we had the laws to protect the customers. So if you look at the blueprint to move us forward now, how would you tie in all of that in terms of coming up with the blueprint as to the new built environment and how we can be successful?
Okay, as I said, obviously this issue of data privacy and data protection, which really has two possible responses. One is legislative, the other is technological. In terms of the security, predominantly you will find sort of technological responses. In terms of privacy, you find technological responses as well. With regards to providing data, text, images, whatever, anything that can identify an individual to large multinationals, I think to some degree there is a little bit of comfort depending on where those multinationals are headquartered and where they operate, okay? When they collect your data, if they are in countries that have very strong data protection requirements, then they would have to comply with these. And it's a matter of understanding. And if you read through the fine print of most of the websites on which this type of information is collected, you will see exactly what measures are in place to protect you, protect your information, and what recourses you have. I know that, and I would say the European Union has probably the most aggressive and the strongest and the most robust data protection measures in the world, and they continue to ratchet up the sort of the ante in relation to that. This is because they have a particular history. It said that the Nazis were able to identify Jews because of the databases that contained information that identified them and therefore allowed government access. So you see a lot of activity at the EU level to protect people's private information. How this has spread around the world is because essentially the EU, which has probably one of the largest spaces of advanced economies around, they have tied it to trade. So they require the transfer of data and any data collected in relation to the EU or by EU entities, essentially to comply with the laws of the EU. And what they've done is that they prohibit the transfer of that data to other jurisdictions unless there are measures in place that satisfy adequacy requirements. Either they're on a white list, which means that the EU has assessed their data protection regime or their privacy regime, legal regime, and decided that it's adequate, so they have no objection to data being stored there. There are very few countries actually that's on that particular white list. The second is by getting the receiver or the company or the entity in the other country outside of the EU to sign contractual commitments that say that they will ensure that the EU standard is met in relation to data that's received from the EU. Now, the regime has been changed and strengthened in that regard, whereas before the contractual clause kind of stood by itself. What you now have is a requirement on the data exporter in the EU to satisfy himself so that he continues to carry the liability in relation to protection of that personal information. even after it's exported. So he must now satisfy himself at the cost of, at the potential of having huge penalties imposed, that the exporting environment has data protection measures in place in order to protect it to the standard that it's required. The third was and this really threw a span in the works. The third was a mechanism called a safe harbor and then a privacy shield that was established in the United States, so that companies in the US that dealt with EU data were able to sign on to this and get sort of exemption. The courts within the EU recently, well, one of the courts within the EU, I think it was an Irish court, overturned or challenged the legitimacy of the privacy shield in the US, and now they're back at the drawing board as to how they're going to deal with transfers of data in and out of the US and between the US and the EU itself. So the concern that Bahamians may have is a legitimate one, okay? But the important thing is, and I know it's difficult because I don't always observe this myself, but read the fine print in terms of how they protect the data. Secondly, look at in the terms and conditions, the applicable laws that govern either the relationship that you have, the commercial relationship that you have with the particular data collector, so that you understand what you are subject to in terms of protections. Now, whether or not a Bahamian data protection law would have effect really depends on what the governing law is of that particular relationship. I know that the data protection law in the Bahamas is applicable to data controllers and collectors in the Bahamas.
Right.
Okay, and so they are controlled. There are also transporter data provisions applicable to that. So the data controllers in the Bahamas themselves also have an obligation to data that is sent outside of the Bahamas for processing or any such activities. But I think that although the concern is there, I believe that the potential for reputational damage to most of the larger entities from data breaches, which is why you don't hear about them for the frequency with which they may happen, is a sufficient deterrent for them to put as robust measures as possible in place to protect data, even from data subjects that live in jurisdictions that may not have strong laws that apply. The EU, if you offer services within the EU and you tailor them in a specific way, services or products online, then you will be caught by the EU data protection laws. I'm not entirely sure that would apply in the Bahamian context, but as we look, and I believe that, even if only to protect our ability to access the EU, continue to access the EU market and other markets around the world that are putting comparable data provisions in place, such as the older Commonwealth countries, a number of the Latin American countries that have a particular history tied to Europe as well. So I believe that we will go in that direction. But as it stands, I believe that essentially the mechanisms, the contractual mechanisms that the larger companies employ are fairly strong and fairly robust. The only headache is basically how do you pursue a violation as a consumer, but that's what lawyers are for in these various countries.
Yeah, so if we look at that picture that you painted, and from the blueprint that you would draw up now, tell us, where do you feel would be the most critical things to address first and foremost, and secondly, once you would have created an environment that you would have envisioned back then and modified for now, where do you see the digital economy in our structure or priority of big economies. Right now, tourism is number one, well, it was COVID and stuff like that. Where would the digital fall on that totem pole of can it be number one? Could it be number 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever? Those
I believe that a digital industry is possible. The digital economy is kind of it's the economy, and it's one that that relies and is driven very heavily by ICT. My view, quite frankly, is that our choices, the option is no longer there. We will be dragged into it for the simple reason that success of the digital economy is that it's global. To me, it makes, it's better for us to prepare our society for the move in this direction as much as possible, accelerate this direction, as opposed to finding ourselves in a situation where, for example, the absence of adequate protections, legal protections, such as an appropriate data protection law, sees us on some list that says this is a questionable jurisdiction to do business with because your information is not protected. Right. We've had the benefit of repeated trips onto these negative lists, and I believe that is particularly another direction. The world as we see it, the digital economy, the global digital economy, is not excluding the Bahamas. And we see the engagement very, very real by a lot of our younger generation who are very digitally savvy, who are very plugged into the global economy, and who are taking full advantage of it in terms of whether it's startup just as they live their lives. So it's here. I can see that efforts are being made in the country. The virtual assets registry, the central bank's digital currency, things of that nature. What I think is that we're small enough, and that's it. We really are very small in comparison to even the big tech companies. One global tech company probably has twice the amount of staff as the population that we have in the Bahamas, or could potentially have that. So we're quite small. If I had to redo a blueprint, or if I was involved, my suggestion would probably have been for us to work on isolate either a community or an island in the Bahamas as a prototype for us to work on, so that gives us an opportunity to essentially determine, how we could then roll that out to the rest of the country, because we need this also for our own purposes. It's a way of bringing the disparate communities together as one. So that is what I would do. Secondly, I would certainly encourage a reversion, or a nod back to something that represents that holistic approach for moving forward a sustainable national. As I said, it may be there. So I'm speaking really from the perspective of what I see happening and what I know from what is generally publicly available. We need to go back to something like that, and we need greater engagement. The other thing we really do need very, very much is a national IT policy that speaks to all of the different components, or a national digital policy. The policy statement that I was involved in 2003 was very, very bare bones, and it was very embryonic. But we need to have policies that speak about a national data strategy. We need to have policies that deal about a national cybersecurity strategy. I understand that one is being worked on with the ITU, or I certainly saw that in the newspaper. Well and good, but we need to accelerate that, because it's those It's those weaknesses that I think make us not only vulnerable from our own perspective, but it makes us vulnerable for isolation and sort of marginalization from the global economy. So my wish list would be that one, okay, and I've said this over and repeatedly, so it's nothing that I shy away from. Every country that I have seen move this agenda forward has very strategically developed something that looks very much like a ministry in and of itself that has responsibility for the rollout of this agenda, the transformation agenda. I believe that we have outgrown having this as a component of a particular ministry. To me, it's a little bit like the Ministry of Works. It's a service ministry. It's a ministry that services the rest of government as well as it services the entire society. So I believe that we need to have that focus, that kind of autonomy and that level of focus so that you have these initiatives and these projects being driven. I also believe that such an agency would have responsibility for your information, your information components of government, your data protection unit, and your information commission, whenever that, your freedom of information, which also would allow for access.
Could you summarize them, because we flat out of time now. This has been very sobering and very informative.
Well, I don't want to scare people. Yeah, I don't want to scare people. Wish list one, an autonomous ministry, adequately resourced, properly resourced, that's focused on innovation, information, and all things pertaining to the digital economy. Okay, as I said, that's adequately resourced. I would like to see also some document or strategic plan, with a blueprint looking at how our society is going to move to this digital agenda, this digital economy. Okay, so to me, those are very critical. One, the adequately resourced, meaning that we have the appropriate skill sets in place. And then what I would like to see more is greater openness in how the government proposes to move forward. When I say openness, greater engagement with the society on how they propose to move forward, recognizing that it's long-term. We have to move away from chopping and changing every 5 years. It's to our detriment, and we have to get commitment and buy-in to move this into a 20-year, 30-year project.
Yes, and so we thank you kindly for those great words of nuggets and wisdom, and we will definitely have to look at bringing you back so we could drill deeper into your vision as moving forward, the 5 wish list points that you mentioned and the like. So on behalf of Michael...
Those are only mine. Those are only mine. There may be others. I mean, this may all be going on. I don't know.
Yes. Well, that's one thing, is we just need more openness, and so we could have more teamwork, and then we'll move the whole country together, right? Forward, onward, upward, together. Anyway, so on behalf of Michael Diggers and myself, I would like to thank you for your sacrifice at 3:30 in the morning, and to be able to be so on point with a lot of things. That is absolutely remarkable. As we do normally, we like to encourage our listeners to always follow the COVID protocols. Wash your hands often, wear your mask, keep your distances, don't go out if you don't have to go out, and by all means, love digitally. Thank you all. Absolutely. And thank you, Rowena. And as we go to our separate ways, you have been listening to Blueprint for Change, the show designed to change your perspective on how you think of national issues facing the Bahamas. We hope, and surely hope, that we have helped you discover your blueprint for change this evening. Thank you, Bahamas, and good night, all.
Blueprint for Change is a collaboration between Michael Diggis and Associates and DomDev Enterprises Limited.